Hello again, everyone. My name is Anthony, and welcome to the second installment of Uncomfortable American History. Now, just a quick reminder why we are doing this. Because we have people and politicians in this country who are really, absolutely trying to whitewash American history. And we are not going to stand for it. So, we're just going to go right into it. Today's episode is Slavery with a Twist. Now, what's this twist? You'll see in a minute. First, let's start with a picture of this guy. Yes, that is a picture of George Washington, the father of our country. Let's choose a couple of myths about George Washington. Let's try, "Oh, father, I cannot lie. I did chop down the cherry tree." That's a myth. That never happened. And also, George Washington was human. So what did he do? He lied. And you'll see later on when he did. The second thing, let's choose something out of thin air, that he wore wooden teeth. He absolutely did not wear wooden teeth in his mouth. Just think about this for a second. Wood in your mouth for a number of hours. What do you think is going to happen to the wood? So no, he had false teeth, but they were made of other substances, other things such as horse's teeth, human teeth, and other assorted niceties. So enough of the myths. Let's get to a couple truths about him. Was he the general that led the Continental Army to victory over the British in the Revolutionary War? Yes, he did that. He did that with help from France, Spain, but we're not here for that. And the second thing, George Washington, the man who fought for freedom from Great Britain, from the tyranny of Great Britain. What's one of the other truths about him? While he was doing that, while he was a general leading people to victory, he also held enslaved people. So there's your twist. George Washington held enslaved people before he was president and during his presidency. And he held those enslaved people here. That is a picture of Mount Vernon in Virginia, not too far from present-day Washington, D.C., where George Washington had his plantation on the banks of the Potomac River, and yes, held enslaved people. The father of our country held enslaved people. I can't repeat that enough. So, was this somewhat hypocritical of him? Because he was actually fighting based upon a few things. One of them is this very famous document right here. Yes, that is a picture of the Declaration of Independence, where men were created equally. And this document was written by none other than another noted slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson. So why don't we take a quick look at some of the text of the Declaration of Independence, and I'll see you on the other side. Take a look right here. So, do those words apply to everybody, even today? I'll leave that for you to decide. Now let's move on. Those words did not apply to particular people. And who are these people I'm talking about? The 10 enslaved people that George Washington took with him as if they were furniture and or cattle after he was elected president of the United States and moved from Mount Vernon first to New York City, which was the first capital of the United States, then to Philadelphia, which was the second capital of the United States. So Let's take a quick look at the list of enslaved people that he took with him as they were just pocket change. Take a look. So you'll note on that list, on the very top of that list, there's a name that begins with the O. Oni. Oni Judge. She becomes important in a second. Well, as George Washington's moving people around, and he does not give these black people agency over their lives because they're enslaved and they have to work for them for free. I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to tell you why we're doing this particular episode. There's a book right here. And the name of the book, as you can see, is Never Caught. And the author of the book is Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Reading this book inspired me to do this particular episode, and I'd like to thank Professor Dunbar for writing this great book. So now, let's move on. As George Washington was living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which was the capital of the United States, right before Washington, D.C. was completed. And by the way, George Washington never lived in Washington, D.C. There were two issues that he had. The first issue was a law passed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania called the Gradual Abolition Act, which in essence stated that if an enslaved person were brought into the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and they stayed there for 6 consecutive months, they were automatically to be freed. So why don't we take a look at a little bit of the text of the Gradual Abolition Act right here. So as you can see, if someone enslaved is in the state of, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they're to be freed after 6 consecutive months of residence. Now, the second issue that George Washington had was a law that he signed into effect. And that law is the Fugitive Slave Act. And before I even try to explain any of it, let's take a long look at this. It's going to be about 20-25 seconds, so take a good look at it right here. So what this law in essence says is that anyone who escapes from involuntary servitude, slavery, can be captured anywhere in the country, but they have to be brought before a judge, and the judge has to make a decision before this enslaved person can be returned to their, for lack of a better term, master. Well, we're going to see that George Washington, now, get ready for this one. George Washington absolutely broke the Pennsylvania law. And he also tried to circumvent the Fugitive Slave Act that he signed into law. Now, just imagine that. A president of the United States not wanting to pay attention to laws. Sound familiar? Well, before we go any further, if you like what you hear so far, please like and subscribe. We can let you know whenever a new episode comes out. They'll be coming out very shortly. Thank you for listening to this point. Now, let's move on and prove our point. So how do we know that George Washington broke the Pennsylvania law? Because we're going to take a look at a letter that he wrote Tobias Lear, who was his personal secretary. And in essence, he tells Mr. Lear to move his enslaved people before the 6-month period is up, thereby resetting the clock, a clear violation of the Gradual Abolition Act in Pennsylvania. Let's take a quick look at some of the text right here. So here we have a president of the United States plotting with someone to circumvent the law. So you see, presidents circumventing the law is not anything new. This started in the beginning of this country. But now let's talk about the Fugitive Slave Act. Well, there's a little backstory to this. Ona Judge, who was living with George and Martha Washington in Philadelphia, discovered she was going to be given away as a wedding gift. Ona Judge was having none of it. She took agency of her person, of her body, and she made a daring plan, and she escaped. She escaped on May 21st, 1796, which infuriated the Washingtons, especially Martha. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick look at a newspaper ad that the Washingtons put out in an attempt to recapture Ona Judge. Take a look at the newspaper ad right here. So they offered a reward for her return. Now, obviously that didn't work. So what George Washington did in response to that is that he then involved the federal government in his attempt to recapture Ona Judge, who eventually fled to New Hampshire. So in his attempt to recapture Ona Judge using the power of the federal government, he sent a letter to Oliver Wolcott Jr., who was the inspector of customs. He was the head of the customs department, which was in charge of all of the seaports in the United States at that time. So what he did was, before we even discuss any more of it, let's take a look at the letter right here. So, again, here we go. The President of the United States is now authorizing a federal official to assist him in the recapture of Ona Judge and not take her before a judge. He wants to capture her, put her on a boat, and send her directly back to Virginia. I don't know about this whole father of our country thing, but it gets worse. So that letter was sent in 1796 in September. So later in November 1796, President Washington wasn't getting very many results. So he wrote a letter to Joseph Whipple, who was the customs collector in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where Ona Judge eventually ended up. So let's take a look at the letter that he wrote to Joseph Whipple, and let's talk about it on the other side right here. So as you can see, George Washington wrote this letter to Joseph Whipple, and George Washington was none too pleased with Mr. Whipple because Whipple actually did have contact with Ona Judge. Ona Judge refused to go with him. I believe that President Washington thought Mr. Whipple was pretty ineffective at his job, and he was very upset with him. But still, Ona Judge remained free, always looking over his shoulder, because can you imagine the power of the presidency? The president wanted her back so that Martha, his wife, wouldn't be so upset. What can I tell you? Now, this comes to an end after George Washington leaves office in March of 1797. He still continued his pursuit of Ona Judge. Now, 4 months before he passed away, on August 11th, 1799, he wrote a letter to his nephew, and his nephew's name is Burwell Bassett Jr., still asking for assistance to recapture Ona Judge. His health is failing, meaning George Washington's health is failing, and one of the things that's on his mind is still the recapture of Ona Judge. Well, about 4 months later, on December 14th, 1799, George Washington passed away. So he never recaptured Ona Judge. Ona Judge was never recaptured. She passed away, technically a free woman, but always looking over her shoulder. Now, here's another interesting twist to this story. George Washington freed all of the slaves that he owned personally in his will after he passed away. Now, we're going to include a link to George Washington's will at the end of this video. Now, I am going to bring it to an end here because there's much more we can talk about, but we just have a limited amount of time. So, therefore, George Washington, the father of our country, owned slaves before and after the American Revolution, as he was fighting to uphold that document, that famous document, the Declaration of Independence, where all men and women are created equal at that time, except if you were a woman or a black person in America, because even freed black people weren't considered citizens. So don't let anybody whitewash history for you. There's much more of this stuff out here. And we here at Uncomfortable American History are going to bring it to you. So therefore, I'd like to bring this to a close by thanking you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Always, always, always teach truth. Let's not whitewash anything, because the only way that we're going to truly understand what's going on in this country is to not push the past aside, but to grab the past, understand the past, look at the flaws of this country, because this country's flawed. I mean, there's some great things about it, but it's also very flawed. And once we reconcile that, maybe, just maybe, we can start to inch forward to a more equitable nation. But right now, that's not happening, especially in certain states in this country. But we're going to leave it there. So again, thank you for listening. Come back next time. Hope to see you. And remember, always, always, always teach truth. Bye for now.